Jackson Hinkle, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, thank you so much for being back on. I really do appreciate it. You know, every time that you're on the show, I think I have to remark on how much your audience has grown. And it's really impressive to me because, you kind of came out of nowhere a few years ago. And now I think you have about 300,000 subscribers on YouTube, 400,000 followers on X. And it's really remarkable to me. So, I probably asked you this before, but how have you grown such a large audience so quickly?
I think it's just a lot of luck. First of all, I mean, when you get people reaching out to you from Tucker Carlson or Piers Morgan and going on those shows, that's just lucky, that right place, right time. But I think there's also a sincere, and I think you can speak to this as well, there's a sincere desire that people have to hear what's really going on in the world. My primary, I cover all things, but my primary I guess concern and interest has always been about foreign policy. Even when I was identified as like a progressive leftist, which was when I first started my show, my interest was always talking about, at the time, Venezuela, Syria, Iran, for example, and critiquing what Donald Trump was doing back then with regard to those countries. And since then, I guess the tables have kind of shifted. You have Bernie Sanders, who's out championing the war in Ukraine. You have AOC and all them that have just become rubber stamps for DNC, military industrial complex, foreign policies and standpoints and actions. And it's really gross to see, but that's always been my focus. And I think there's a lot of people, especially now with BRICS, with what's going on in Ukraine, with the situation in Africa that's been developing just over the past, 4 months. People want to hear what's happening. And I think there's a lot of people across the world that want to hear it from an American perspective and someone that's not going along with the mainstream media narrative.
So yeah, you mentioned Piers Morgan, and that was really interesting. And I've seen you debate all these different talking heads over the past few years. From Vosh to Sam Cedar, that ridiculous debate. I mean, he really just forfeited that one. That was the one where he just was saying, "I don't care" the whole time about every point that you're making.
For support when she is going to be withholding her support for these bills.
Okay.
What do you mean, okay? What is this okay? You have one of the largest news shows on YouTube for leftist politics, and you refuse to criticize them. You just say, okay, you say, I don't care. What is this? Do you not have any values that you stand upon?
No.
But the Piers Morgan debate that you were in recently, that was really good. It was amazing to see you counter everything that he was saying. And then also you made a really great point about how all of these folks who keep talking about, the poor Ukrainians, they did not care at all about what was happening in the Donbass with a Nazi genocide that was happening there for 8 years straight.
The trouble is, some of the stuff you said in your initial response is historically defensible. You can argue from 2014, there's been this issue there. I get that. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. But when you say that Putin's only game here is to go and liberate the Ukrainians from Nazis, you just sound completely bonkers. Bonkers. Not to say there aren't some far-right people with Nazi tendencies in Ukraine. There are, as there are in many countries. But the idea this is a Nazi-run country when the president is Jewish, never mind anything else, is laughably ridiculous.
Well, just because he's Jewish doesn't mean he's not sicking his Azov Nazi thugs on ethnic Russians in the Donbass.
You think a Jewish president is going to be actively promoting Nazism? That's your position.
The ones with swastika tattoos and Hitler tattoos in Mariupol, for example.
You know what, Jackson?
But what I'll say, Pierce, one question. What I'll say is, if you're so outraged over the atrocities allegedly of Putin in Ukraine and all these Ukrainians that have been killed, and you tweet about it nonstop, why did you not tweet once about the atrocities that were perpetrated by the Ukrainian government from 2014 to 2022 against those ethnic Russians in the Donbass?
Well, yeah, Constantine.
Well, yeah, that was an awesome conversation, and I have to give credit to Pierce for just the first 5 minutes. He kind of just let me spew out everything that needed to be said. I thought that it was going to be one of those instances where they cut you off and start interjecting, trying to ask, but he really let me talk. And I think he's fair with a lot of his guests he brings on. You know, I actually watch his show because I like a lot of what he has to say about cultural values and what he debates people on there. I don't always agree with him, but I think he makes an entertaining show nonetheless. And so I just try to get out as much information as possible, the historical events that led to what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. And, you know, you're right in pointing out that I don't think anyone's ever asked him about his silence on what happened to ethnic Russians in the Donbass prior to 2022. And I wouldn't have even brought it up had he, at some point, it didn't even have to be between 2014 and 2022, but like at some point, maybe throughout all his moaning and groaning about the poor Ukrainians now, which it is poor Ukrainians. There's a lot of people that are dying and suffering, and we should have a peace deal as soon as possible. But he's never mentioned, even still, the events that took place prior to February 24th, 2022. And I find that incredible. I mean, personally, I didn't talk a lot about what was going on my program, but I followed it quite closely. You know, the Gray Zone did great coverage prior to 2022. They were interviewing people like Russell Bentley, Texas, who was an American fighting in the Donbass, older guy from Texas that went to go fight over there against the Azovites. And that was the first time I'd ever heard about this. I was like, really? Nazis over there? Like, really? And I started to look into it, and that maybe was early 2020 or something when I think they interviewed him, and I was just so shocked. And you know, Trump was in office, and that's when I began to follow it more closely. But it is crazy that everyone is only talking about it post 2022. They don't talk about the history that led up to it. Anyways, I think his lack of an answer to that question, why do you only talk about the, you know, Ukrainians in the Donbass that are suffering post 2022? You know, his lack of an answer showed exactly, you know, what I think we all have come to realize is that these people don't care about Ukrainians. They don't care. They never cared about the people in Afghanistan or Syria or Iran or Venezuela. Piers Morgan was one of the only guys who was calling out the madness in Iraq. And, you know, he's very proud of that. George Galloway brought up that point that Piers Morgan was one of the only guys that was speaking facts on Iraq when that was unfolding initially in the early 2000s. But they don't care. They don't care about people impacted by sanctions. They don't care about any of this stuff. Piers Morgan, since Iraq, has gone on with every single deep state talking point with regard to war and foreign policy. So, you know, he invited me on that show. They invited me back on again. He mentioned that at the end of our conversation, he'd like to have me back on again. And he just actually returned from his summer break, or I think it was like a summer fall break. And so I'm going to be out there maybe doing an in-person debate in studio in the UK. We'll see. I'm going to Russia and I might come back through the UK. If not, I hope he doesn't give up on having me on again, because I think the reaction to that interview was pretty good. And I think maybe even he may have changed his views. We'll have to see what happens when I go on again. But he received a lot of backlash for his lack of answers. And also, I mean, you saw it in the conversation. He started off by saying it was all bollocks, it was a load of crap, whatever. And then the second time we came around back to like me talking in the interview, he said, you know, I think there's some historical points that you can definitely say are true with regard to your initial statement. And I'm like, so do you agree, or is it all a bunch of bollocks and crap, you know? So we'll see in the second conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? Is that I think that there's so much history that is not presented to so many people. And a lot of people come at this, you know, from a good place of caring about the Ukrainians and, you know, oh, this sucks that their country was invaded by Putin and he's a monster. But you don't talk about how George Soros interfered in Ukraine for years and was quoted as saying, if this isn't interference in another country, I don't know what is. You had, you know, the Bush administration being involved in the Orange Revolution, them announcing that they're going to annex Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. The fact that a lot of Ukrainians said that they did not want to be part of NATO prior to 2014. Then you had this coup that took place that was clearly backed by the U.S. You actually had U.S. Senators John McCain and Chris Murphy participating in this coup, this anti-democratic coup. So, it's really, you just don't hear those facts presented, as well as everything that happened afterwards with, Victoria Nuland being involved and the CIA and arming Nazis, criminalizing socialist parties and media outlets, and, even up to now where you have the election next year, presumably not happening. So I don't know how we can say we're really fighting for freedom and democracy when there's not even going to be an election next year.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's insane. And I think one thing we should all point out is in Russia, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation is the second largest party. Zyuganov is the head of it. And they were making the case for the past 8 years, since 2014, that Putin, needs to do something. They talked about an SMO, but they said you need to do something to help these ethnic Russians in the Donbass. They were saying that for years and years and years, way before this war broke out, as they say, on February 24th of 2022. So, we can look at everything that's happened and you can say, oh, Putin's the worst guy in the world for what he did. But I guess if you're a liberal, if you're in the deep state, or you're in the U.S. intelligence community, all those things can and are usually synonymous, by the way. It's like, you should be thankful that you didn't have someone who was more hardline when it comes to the Russian position in office in Russia, because there's a lot of people upset that Putin wasn't doing enough. And Putin's even come to say that that was a mistake, that he didn't do something sooner. And I happen to agree with that. And, there's other things that he could have done besides an SMO. That's a point of debate as well. But people were saying you need to do something. And he waited 8 years. 15,000 people died. You had a lot of issues that resulted in not just the Donbass, but you look at Odessa as well, and the massacre there. I don't know. I think it's worthy for debate that the West should be very thankful that they have Putin in office, because he waited a long time to do this. And another point I might add is maybe he should have waited this long, because we know that if they hadn't have waited this long, if they had tried to do something back in 2015 or 2014, their economy was not prepared to take that big leap of faith and wreak all of the sanction warfare that they were going to have to face. So Russia prepared their economy, which is good. They've been pretty much unaffected by it. Their economy has grown $600 billion in increased wealth in Russia the past year alone. It's now the top 5th largest economy in the world in terms of purchasing power parity. It's surpassed Germany, the UK, France. So they're doing pretty good, and things could be better, but they're doing pretty good, and I think they're doing better than everyone expected.
Well, you've been following this war a lot more closely than I have, honestly. And, I'm kind of curious what your take is as far as the current state of it and where it's going, because the way that it seems now is it's at a bit of a stalemate, where this this counteroffensive has not progressed at all. Really, from what I can tell, all the counteroffensive really is drone attacks inside Russia and, terrorist operations like that. So it seems as though it's at a bit of a stalemate. Ukraine is not, Kiev's forces are not crossing over into the area that Russia is occupying. Russia does not really seem to be pushing further into Ukraine. So just curious what your thoughts are on the current state of the war, where it's going, and if we are going to potentially see any kind of peace deal, if that's even possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think a peace deal should have been struck in the first week. Ukraine could have saved a ton of territory if they had done that, at least for the foreseeable future, for years and years and years. They could have prevented any further Russian advances for years if they had signed a peace deal the first week this broke out. Because what did we see happen? We saw the Russians move in the Kiev Oblast, and the Ukrainians said, look, we see this Turkish peace deal proposal, this Israeli peace proposal. If you remove your troops from the Kiev Oblast, then we will move forward with this peace deal. And the US, I think the UK, France, Germany, Russia, China had signed up, Turkey had signed on as security guarantors for Ukraine. And they would have saved a ton of territory. But now we look at the situation. Russia has 87,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory that they've now actually brought into the formally into the Russian Federation. They've joined the Donbass, Donetsk, Lugansk, most of Zaporozhia, a good chunk of Kherson, a good chunk of Kharkov into the Russian Federation. And when this, I mean, the Ukrainian counteroffensive, you're 100% correct. It went nowhere, right? The Russians built up a security zone, or a gray zone as they called it, which was on the very front line villages that have populations of like 400 people pre-war. And they just littered these villages with mine traps and tank traps. And then behind that, they had three lines of defense lines. The first line is called the Surovikin line, where they had defense fortifications that, you can see from satellites. They built these in for over a year now. And they were preparing for what they knew was to come, which was a Ukrainian counteroffensive largely targeted at cutting the Russians off from Crimea. And then behind those three defense lines, they have tens of thousands of more reservists that could be deployed at a moment's notice. And then Russia actually, in addition to that, they have more reservists in Russia still today than they have Russian troops on the entire Ukrainian battlefront. So they've got plenty of men. Russia's population is like 100 million people larger. It's a huge population. And Ukraine got nowhere with their counteroffensive. We're now 80 plus, 90 plus days, something to that effect, into this counteroffensive. Yeah, sure, they've launched a few drone attacks. They've done that. But what's the battlefield look like? They've just today, apparently, started to reach the first line of Russian defense fortifications. The Western backers and those in the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, like Reznikov, they thought that they were going to be able to cut through all three defensive lines within the first 2 weeks of this counteroffensive. So they've done nothing. They've done nothing whatsoever. The Russians, on the other hand, they've been able to defend their lines. Ukrainians, as I said, have not broken through even the first line. They're starting to reach the first line, but when they try to break through, it's going to be a very, very bad situation for Ukraine because the Russians are so prepared now. The Ukrainians lost a ton of armor, a ton of weapons, a ton of tanks, a ton of these armored vehicles and IFVs. They don't really know what to do anymore. They've lost a ton of men as well. They've wasted huge supplies of ammunition. And what are the Russians planning next? Well, the Russians say, well, we basically defeated the Ukrainian counteroffensive without even lifting a muscle. They got caught in our mine traps, and that was the biggest blow of all. So the Russians right now are preparing an offensive of their own. We don't have the Russian playbook before us, but word on the street is the rumors are that Russia is going to be targeting the Kharkov direction in the northeast of the country of Ukraine to try and recapture that, because the Ukrainians regathered that territory in their counteroffensive several months ago. So they're going to be going back after the whole Kharkov direction. They're already moving in on Kupiansk, which is the administrative city in the region. They're probably going to be going after the flanks of Bakhmut, because the Ukrainians keep trying to push in on the flanks of Bakhmut in cities like Kalashnikovka. So the Russians, with the help of the Chechen special forces, are going to be completely, liberating that territory. And then there's also theories that maybe the Russians will try to push through in Kherson, which was subject to the missile strike that blew up the Kakhovka Dam, which caused the mass flooding in the region just a couple months ago. There's a thought that maybe the Russians are going to try to go back into Kherson city, but we'll have to see and wait and see what happens there. But after that, the Russians will probably wait for any Ukrainian counteroffensives again. And then next spring is when most people expect there to be a large-scale Russian, blowout offensive that will go for Nikolaev, maybe Odessa, and all the territory that they aim to get before seriously pushing for negotiations once more.
So something else I wanted to ask you about is Prigozhin, because this summer we had this alleged mutiny that took place where he was marching towards Moscow, and it was a very weird day when that took place. But then he turned around and was supposed to be going to Belarus, but he died recently, seemingly in a plane crash. So I'm curious what your thoughts are both on that alleged mutiny that took place and on the death of Prigozhin. Can you just kind of share your general thoughts on what happened with both of those?
Yeah, talking with Russians and Russian servicemen that I've had the fortune to speak with, they viewed Prigozhin prior to the mutiny as a patriot, a man who served his country. and was deeply committed to doing so. I mean, this guy was as we all know, like an entrepreneur, restaurateur, food catering, eventually rose to the level of what I think would qualify as an oligarch within Russia. But he was an oligarch that was a patriot as well. And he was committed to serving Russia and their mission against Ukraine. He's an interesting character because he was never in the military. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't an officer, commander, general. He wasn't in the Russian MOD. And even as the head of Wagner, I mean, this wasn't a guy that was making day-by-day calls about where Wagner troops would be stationed, where they'd be fighting, what they'd be doing. But he was the, de facto head of the organization. He didn't even start Wagner, but he was the face of it. He was the leader of it. And I think what I'll say about Prigozhin, and I agree generally for what it's worth, I'm an American, so it doesn't really matter what I think about whether or not he's a patriot or not. But I generally agree with the people in Russia who have those sentiments about Prigozhin. He was out on Bakhmut for like 280 days on the front. He saw so much blood, so much carnage, so much death. And there was a lot of death. They rounded up all these men they conscripted them, volunteers basically from the Russian prison system. A lot of these guys did not have much military training. They sent them out to this very bloody front in Bakhmut, and a lot of people died. So he saw a crazy amount of death. And I think, especially for a man that has no military experience whatsoever, I can't imagine what that would be like. I don't think any of us can really imagine what that would be like. I mean, even Wagner troops, they had a good turnover rate for the most part. They'd be on the front for a little bit and then they get pulled back. On the front for a little bit, pulled back. He was out there seeing all the madness through and through. So I think that has a significant impact on a man's psyche. And I think we saw that with the whatever mutiny that was aimed at the MOD structure, aimed at Shoigu, aimed at Gerasimov, aimed at others in the MOD. And then, what I think happened, I don't know. No one will probably ever know. But I mean, this is a guy who's faked his death before in the DRC. They had a funeral and then he showed up alive 3 days later. I think that he did die. I think that I don't necessarily know if it was Putin. I think it's very possible it was Putin or the Kremlin or the Siroviki, which is like the Russian deep state, who may have done something like this. But things lead me to believe that it probably wasn't them. I mean, you're in the middle of the BRICS summit, right? Putin's trying to convince all these world leaders that Russia's safe for business. My control on power is stable and secure. You don't have to worry about it. This Prigozhin business is in the past. So why would you want to remind everyone, the Saudis, the Indians, why would you want to remind all of them about this Prigozhin business? Well, you could also say maybe he wanted to remind them in the sense that, hey, look, this is done. I've officially ended this, any potential threats. But the other thing is Prigozhin wasn't putting forward any threats. He was in Africa. He was in Belarus. He was doing his stuff over there. What I think is more likely, and Alexander Mercouris has brought up this point on the Duran, is that it is possible. I mean, there's no shortage of people who wanted to see Prigozhin dead. The list goes on and on and on. He's probably one of the most hated people that has the longest list of people who want him dead on the face of the planet. But there probably very well could have been an internal Wagner, affair that resulted in a bomb being placed on his plane. Apparently, there was very high up officials within Wagner who were upset that Prigozhin didn't take Putin's offer to fully integrate all of Wagner into the MOD structure of the Russian military right after this mutiny took place. And Prigozhin said, oh, we can go to Belarus. Let's go to Belarus. And all my men, let's go over there. They didn't have heavy equipment, heavy armor, heavy weaponry when they went, but they chose at the discretion of Prigozhin not to take Putin's offer to fully integrate into the Russian MOD and to sign contracts with the army. So some people think that maybe, like Mercouris, they think maybe this was some sort of an internal affair within Wagner. The leadership didn't think that Prigozhin was a befitting candidate to continue running operations, and they thought he was a loose cannon. Maybe this is a man who'd been impacted by the war and seeing all that blood and carnage, and they wanted him out and to simply do away with this problem. Who knows? But I think that is a potential source of whatever was responsible for the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Well, I'd like to segue over to the 2024 election, but just in the context of this war, I think that any kind of conflicts, even proxy wars like this that America's involved in, the public slowly over time starts to turn against it, and I think that we're seeing that currently. So, I'm wondering how this is going to impact the 2024 election. Obviously, Trump says he'll end the conflict on day one, but as far as Joe Biden and the Biden administration and Democrats generally, what do you think their game plan is here? Because, we see them sending more and more weapons, more and more money to Ukraine. We've seen them send cluster munitions. We see them now sending depleted uranium. There's going to be supposedly F-16s next year. So it seems as though the only game plan really is escalation. But, I have to wonder, going into next year's election, at some point, you figure they have to become desperate and would be willing to do some kind of peace deal.
Desperate into a peace deal, or desperate and try to gain a war footing and launch a hot war with Russia, right? Who knows? These people are insane. They are literally insane. They have no regard for Russian life. They want to do away with Russian civilization wherever it manifests in the world. And Tucker Carlson said it on his interview with Adam Carolla this week. He said, "I bet my house that there's going to be a hot war with Russia before, the next election." I don't think that's too far out of the realm of possibility. I think there is a possibility that that's where things might head. Joe Biden, who knows if he'll make it to the election? I think it's getting late, though, to choose some sort of a Democratic nominee if it's not going to be Biden. I mean, you already had the first GOP presidential debate. Biden still is intent on running. He's made no points that he's thinking about not running. Gavin
Plus,
Newsom,
they also have the problem too of like, who would they replace him with? I mean, I guess Gavin Newsom, but like, so many Democrats are disliked by the majority of the American public.
Yeah, exactly. And there's no simple answer for them. I mean, they are in a pickle right now. Gavin Newsom has his problems. RFK is not a fan. He's not a friend of those in the deep state, except for maybe those that are of Zionist backing. But so Biden, who knows if he even makes it. Trump, though, the question is like, well, look at what they're doing to him. They're talking about a potential. They already said like a March court date for Donald Trump. Now they're talking about October, late October. This is crazy what they're doing to him. They're trying to lock him up in prison. And if that doesn't work, I mean, I've said for quite a while, I think if they put him in prison, he's still going to win from prison. I don't think that's going to stop anyone at this point.
Well, it seems as though the charges are helping him, right? Like every time he gets more charges, he goes up in the I mean, it's helping him secure the Republican nomination, if nothing else.
I have plenty of problems with Donald Trump. I think the MAGA movement is great because it really doesn't answer to Donald Trump. I think in more ways than one, we've seen Donald Trump answer to the MAGA movement, and MAGA is they've held Trump accountable in various ways. And but despite all that, seeing Donald Trump with a mugshot, like that makes me far more inclined to chip in, give him $15 or something. Like I don't know. And I'm not even the biggest Trump guy. Seeing what he's done on foreign policy, I think he's gotten better, far better than when he began. And you can make criticisms, and you can also recognize the reality of the situation he's in. When you become president, you have to hire like tens of thousands of people just on the turn of a dime within like 2 months. He relied on the RNC to hire all of those people, and they made really, really typical decisions. John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, like these are horrendous people. And I think at the end of his administration, he brought in people like Colonel Douglas Macgregor. He brought in far better people that were making sound and reasonable decisions, like getting us out of Afghanistan, which was an operation that was then bungled and delayed by Joe Biden. But my thoughts on the election, I mean, I don't know. These are the conversations I don't know if you can even have on YouTube anymore, but I think they'll do anything to make sure that Donald Trump does not enter the White House. If he does, though, do I think that he can end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours? I think he's the only guy capable out of everyone who's running right now, including RFK Jr., to actually bring it into this war. 24 hours is that's quite the mission. But if you if you turn off the tap of U.S. funding to Ukraine, the Ukrainian government falls in a matter of hours. And he has said, if Ukraine doesn't agree to a peace deal in 24 hours, then that's exactly what we're going to do. So it is possible, it's feasible. And I don't think he really cares about Ukraine. And I think he'd be willing to do it if it means peace, because at his core, I think he's a guy that may have been misguided in his efforts to secure peace, but I think he does, in fact, value peace.
Well, I have to kind of wonder too, now that they are charging him with 100 charges across 4 different cases that could theoretically put him in jail for 1,000 years. I think that Democrats have to be more desperate now, because, or the deep state generally, because if he does get back in office, what would stop Trump from going and charging all of them? Particularly Joe Biden, with all this corruption that's coming out currently, and of course that's going to factor into the election also. But it seems as though they absolutely have to keep, it's really like a life and death thing for both, because Trump has to win to keep himself from serving a time in prison, right? He needs to win so that he can get himself out of jail, and they have to also win to keep themselves out of jail. But beyond those dynamics, I have to wonder if this is really good for the American Republic, that you have these two factions who are going to be charging each other with crimes going through each of the different elections. I mean, moving forward, is that what's going to happen in 2028 and 2032? Is just going to be criminal charges against from the party that's in power against the party that's out of power? Or I mean, it just seems we're going into real banana republic, collapse of the American empire territory.
We are. And I think the floodgates were opened by the deep state Republicans and Democrats. Like, think back when Donald Trump was in his last few days in office. Everyone was saying, is he going to pardon Julian Assange and Snowden? And Glenn Greenwald was on the inside circle of these debates when this was all going on. And he has come out since and said, yeah, Donald Trump didn't pardon Assange or Snowden because of the fact that Mitch McConnell, Republican, said, if you do, we're gonna give the Democrats the votes that they need to go through with this impeachment and actually impeach you. And so, I mean, the floodgates were opened then, but Donald Trump had no time. He wasn't elected again, so he couldn't do anything about it. Now the Democrats and the deep state have doubled down with all these crazy charges. So they've opened up everything, and they could actually go one step further before an outright assassination. They're thinking about charging him with insurrection. If you charge someone with insurrection, your name can't be on the ballot. So they're actually talking about getting him off the ballot now. So they could do whatever they want, and I don't think that there's anything that's going to stop them. If Donald Trump somehow does get in, yeah, the floodgates have been opened, not by him, but by them, and it's going to be all out war. And I guess as an American patriot, someone who wants the best for our country, I sit back and I say, gosh, this is banana republic stuff, as you said. But it's the implosion of a system that needed to be imploded from many, many years ago. And I don't like it, but I also welcome it at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, it did need to be taken apart. I guess the tricky part is actually having to live through it, right? And where this is actually going to go. Like, could it be civil war? Would they be willing to take us into World War III with Russia to try to get out of this? I mean, it's kind of scary territory. But again, having lived through COVID and all of that, it's like we're living in strange times, it seems.
We definitely are. And there's no end in sight to it all. I mean, World War III with Russia, we all know what Putin would do. I mean, that's mutually assured destruction. That's nuclear warfare. And Putin has he's had to walk a very narrow tightrope throughout his entire presidency, from when he got in, dealing with the Chechen wars, dealing with Georgia, dealing with the oligarchs in Russia, dealing with the economy. He's like the perfect guy for Washington, in the sense that he's not a total hardliner, so they should just do business with him and accept it for what it is. And he's not a Yeltsin, he's not Khrushchev, and just accept them for who he is. Because if you don't, you're not going to defeat him. And if you don't, you're going to have, again, mutually assured destruction. And that's going to be bad for everyone.
And the weird thing from my perspective is that I remember when the Democrats were actually somewhat sane towards Russia. You know, again, because this was really the Bush administration, the neocons, who pushed this idea of meddling in Russia, meddling in Ukraine, and annexing Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. And even in the 2012 election, this was a main line of attack by the Democrats against Mitt Romney, his Russophobia.
Well, this is to Russia. This is, without question, our #1 geopolitical foe.
After all, you don't call Russia our #1 enemy unless you're still stuck in a Cold War mind warp.
Governor Romney is mired in a Cold War mindset. He acts like he thinks the Cold War is still on.
He's even blurted out the preposterous notion that Russia is our #1 geopolitical foe.
It's somewhat dated to be looking backwards.
The statements that Governor Romney makes show little understanding of what is actually going on in the 21st century.
It's a really curious statement given that the Cold War has been over for some time.
A throwback to the Cold War. I mean, we work with Russia all the time.
He's not a dumb man, but he said something that was clearly dumb.
It is an antiquated worldview.
Is he trying to play Ronald Reagan here or what? What's he up to?
The 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because, you know, the Cold War has been over for 20 years.
But somewhere around 2013, 2014, they just went off the deep end and became neocons. It's like the Democratic Party was replaced by neocon pod people. And it's just, it's crazy. You know, what I'd love to do at some point is just sit down some liberals and like make them watch an episode of The Daily Show from like 15 years ago. Because I think that they would just have a breakdown. They wouldn't be able to understand how far the party has gone in the last 15 years, where again, they have become Bush, McCain, Romney neocons.
Yeah, I mean, that's just like what I said at the start, you know, like I used to be leftist, and now look at where Bernie Sanders is. I was a Bernie Sanders supporter. Look at where he is now. He's out here critiquing and criticizing Cornel West because Cornel West, a Green Party candidate, is saying bad things about Joe Biden. And heaven forbid we say anything bad about Joe Biden. I mean, there's no left, there's no populist left. There's nothing left. Like, you know, like people like you, Jimmy Dore, you know, Craig Jardula, like no one is represented whatsoever in any form of, you know, political representation in Washington anymore. And it's sad to see. It's sad to see because how are we supposed to, you know, like remember Senator Paul, like he'd always try to push through these, they were just anti-interventionist bills regarding like Syria or maybe Iraq. And he would get Democratic votes on these bills that he put forward. Mm-hmm. The most recent bills we've seen put forward by like Matt Gaetz, for example, saying we don't want to continue funding this Ukraine madness. They get no Democrat support whatsoever, like not a single vote in the House out of all these hundreds of members. The Republicans are also terrible, but at least there's maybe like a couple dozen, 3 dozen, 2 dozen that sign off on this begrudgingly, knowing that it's not going to pass and that it doesn't matter if it does pass, but they can write their name on it and look good signing it. It's a very scary state of affairs. The only saving grace is that you have the question mark of Donald Trump, and I don't trust him. I don't trust any of these people, but he's someone who I think, you know, maybe there's an ounce of faith that we could put towards him and blowing this whole thing up and ending the war and securing peace. But that's a long shot in it of itself for many reasons.
So I did want to go a little bit more in depth with these other candidates in the race, just to know what your thoughts are on them. And you mentioned RFK, and you mentioned, you know, his Zionist ties there. But overall, what do you think about RFK? What do you think about him running as a Democrat? And yeah, again, if you want to kind of go into, you know, some of his perspective on Israel.
Yeah, I mean, his perspective on Israel is abhorrent. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's personal because, you know, people say Sirhan was the guy that killed his father and he's, you know, Palestinian and he made it about Palestine when he killed his father. But I think everyone knows that Sirhan wasn't either the only or the party responsible for killing his father. And I think if anyone, RFK Jr. probably knows that. I mean, there was literally more bullets fired into RFK's body than Sirhan could have loaded up in his gun. The bullets came from the opposite direction of Sirhan. So, I mean, that thing doesn't really make sense. The Kennedys have long, relations and ties with Israel. So maybe it's a family. I don't know, but it's terrible. And I hope that he debates Max Blumenthal, because Max Blumenthal, he put out the offer. Then RFK's team said no, and we're not debating anyone. RFK's running for president. We're not doing debates. And then RFK said, yes, I will debate. So it's gone back and forth. I just want to see it happen now.
But it's ridiculous, though, too, because he's challenging this other guy. Him and Joe Rogan are challenging this other guy to debate COVID, right? So
yeah,
I think that really speaks to, how controversial or how much we're not supposed to talk about the Israel issue. If it's more controversial than COVID or the Ukraine war, like that really says something.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And it's just crazy. It's like, if you believe in this so much, why don't you talk to Max? Because Max is like the expert, and he grew up in a Jewish household. So I think that'd be a perfect person to talk to. So we'll see what happens. His stance on Ukraine, he gets the issues that led to the Ukraine crisis 100% correct. And I have to say thank you, because I think he's probably converted millions of people who've watched his videos on Joe Rogan or wherever, Lex Friedman, as to people that may have been sympathetic to Ukraine, now seeing the bigger picture and understanding what's really happening. But his solution is terrible. His solution is like Zelensky's wet dream. His solution is, we're going to tell the Russians to get out of the Donbass and all occupied territories. We're going to send in UN peacekeepers, and we're going to create like a gray zone there. Well, that's exactly what Zelensky's asking for. And Putin, we all know what Putin's not going to do that. Putin's not going to just, oh yeah, sure, I'm going to take all my troops out. We lost 150,000 men fighting for this territory, and now we're just going to take them out and go back to Russia. That's not going to happen either. They've already incorporated formally these territories into the Russian Federation. That's not going to happen. And Ukraine's going to lose more territory. So I think his solution is extremely naive. I don't think it necessarily comes from like a place of ill intent. I think it's probably just a naive position. But I think he's polling at 20%. I haven't seen him go higher than like 15-20%. We'll see what happens. I'd love to see a debate, but we know that's not going to happen between him and Biden. So yeah, I don't know. I don't even know why he ran in the Democratic Party, to be honest. Jimmy Dore brought up that point too. It's like, why run in the Democratic Party? This is a dead end. And he's a good candidate for a lot of reasons. So why would you not at least try?
Yeah, so from my perspective, I kind of get why he ran as a Democrat, because, the Kennedys are this dynasty within the Democratic Party. And also, I think there is something to be said of how there was an anti-war liberal movement inside the Democratic Party previously. I mean, and again, not that long ago, like 15 years ago. And it's gone away now, and they've been replaced by neocons. So I think it would be, a great story to have a Kennedy come and, put back together that anti-war coalition within the Democratic Party and potentially win the nomination. If they had a fair and open primary process, they had a Democratic primary process, which of course they don't. But yeah, what's going to be really weird is that he's going to end up endorsing Biden. We all know that, because what would be the best case scenario is they screw him out of the nomination, as we all know that he's going. I mean, the best case is that he wins, but that's impossible. They're going to screw him out of the nomination. What he should do at that point is go run with Trump, and we'd see a Democrat and Republican running together for the first time since 1860 with Lincoln and Johnson. But that's not going to happen. And what's going to be really weird is to see RFK, after running against the proxy war in Ukraine and against the COVID mandates and against the shitty economy and everything else, the status quo, he's going to turn around and endorse Joe Biden, just like Bernie Sanders did, just like Tulsi Gabbard did. And it's going to be a weird day next March.
Yeah. I think Donald Trump RFK ticket would be damn near unstoppable. I don't like this idea of Vivek running. I don't like Vivek Ramaswamy. That guy's a China hawk, and he's absolutely horrendous and ludicrous with his ideas about China. But I think RFK and Donald Trump would be unstoppable. And I think a lot of it's like RFK doesn't necessarily, like, I don't know if he's proven himself as a leader. He's got some good ideas, but what does that mean if you want to be president? Okay, anyone could have good ideas, but You have to prove yourself to be a leader. And I think in a position like he's in, where he's definitely got support, but he doesn't command a movement like Make America Great Again. Like Trump's got an army. He's got a cult, an army, and an army specifically that I don't even know if you can call it a cult because it holds him accountable on like COVID or Ukraine or other things. But RFK he's got a lot of great ideas. So I think he'd make a great vice president. And I think he'd be a great additional voice in the ear of Donald Trump, assuming, he wins the presidency. But I definitely don't want to see him have to do the old song and dance and endorse Joe Biden. That would be the worst.
Well, again, just on the Zionism thing, what's really weird is this character Shmuley Botek, and I don't know how much you know about him, but he actually was attacking RFK a couple months ago because RFK had put out a tweet seemingly in support of Roger Waters. And then magically, RFK deleted that tweet and then started showing up at events with Shmuley Botek. And this is a guy who's, he's appeared in public with many different presidential candidates, Tulsi Gabbard, Cory Booker, Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence. He's done interviews with Marianne Williamson. So Republicans and Democrats. And it's very odd to see how they're all kind of drawn to this one person. And I think that also speaks to the influence of Zionism on all of these different candidates. I mean, we really don't have an anti-Zionist candidate. I mean, with the possible exception of Cornel West.
Yeah, Cornel West, the only one. And the crazy thing is, I am slightly familiar with him, but there's plenty of Orthodox Jews that are not supportive of Zionism and understand what's happening in Palestine. So it's like, yeah, to think that this guy speaks for everyone, it's such a joke. Everyone knows that there's plenty of Jewish people who stand opposed to Zionism. So Zionism is it's a tool, and it sources its power from the capitalist class. And I think that's everything you need to know about it, because for everything that they do, the Zionists do, and pushing their ideology all across political lines, there's a lot of people who are upset by it. But who, at the end of the day, bears the brunt of the criticism of the Zionists? It's usually the average, Jewish working man, and he, in many cases, doesn't support Zionism. So it creates a bunch of problems, and I just think that this overload of support, uncritical support, unquestioned support for Israel and Zionism is ludicrous. You can say Israel's done some good things. I think Israel has been, especially in Ukraine, a powerful country that's pushed for peace and put forward a good peace proposal. They haven't done really a whole lot to support Ukraine, and they've denied a lot of Ukraine's calls to provide weaponry, drones for their military effort against the Russians. But to provide uncritical support for Israel and all the crimes that they commit against the Palestinians and other nations, Syria, for example, we need to end that.
Well, just again, on the subject of Cornel West, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on him. Again, he seems to be one of the most anti-war voices, along with RFK. However, him and RFK both have these expressions about Russian imperialism. He also seems to draw a distinction between Trump and Biden, where he calls Trump a neo-fascist and just calls Biden a neoliberal, where there's plenty of arguments, I think, that Joe Biden is also a neo-fascist. So, just overall, what are your thoughts on Cornel West?
I mean, the guy's a joke. You look at what he did. I saw his interview on Fox News. Like, this was his big break, right? He's on Fox News. I think it was near prime time or during prime time. And he went out there, and you're talking to, these are people who are maybe still watching. It was right after the firing of Tucker Carlson, I think. It was right after. And he goes out, and like you said, he called Trump a neo-fascist, but said, Biden's a neoliberal. Then he says that China and Russia are imperialist actors. Well, that's ludicrous on its face. Like, I don't even know where to begin with that. I'm laughing when he's saying that. Then he's asked about, issues of, like transgenderism and it was just a horrendous appearance on Fox News. You're trying to reach across the aisle. You're a Green Party candidate. You're trying to get those disaffected voters, independent voters, non-voters. And this guy, I mean, in more ways than one, he just sounded like a typical CNN, host. He sounded like Rachel Maddow, calling China and Russia imperialists, evil actors, this sort of stuff. His comments on women's sports and who should be allowed in women's sports, and then also the Trump fascist claim. It's just like I really don't have any respect for the guy. And when he first announced his campaign, I hope for the best. And I don't think it's really important to cast stones in his direction because he's not going anywhere and he has like no support and he has no media presence whatsoever, basically. So it's not really a top concern of mine to cast stones in this direction. But if asked, I guess I'd say that his candidacy, his positions, it's a joke. And it's sad to see because I think he used to take a pretty bold line when he was national co-chair for Bernie Sanders. I think he took a bold line on a lot of issues that he's kind of toned down.
So, Jackson, I also wanted to ask you about, I guess, a potential debate. There's been some back and forth between you recently and Nick Fuentes. And it's kind of funny because it's been in regards to this Oliver Anthony song, Men North of Richmond, which has taken the airwaves by storm and it's everywhere. And he's been on, Oliver Anthony has been on Joe Rogan. But Nick Fuentes, he did a couple monologues, very long, like 40-minute monologues on his show, talking about how he was against the concept of this song because it was coming from a victim mentality. And, he thinks that he's very focused on white people. So he's saying white people should be wanting to aspire to greatness and not wanting to be poor. He was attacking his Oliver Anthony's X handle. It's Ain't Got a Dollar. And I guess you spoke out against that and were pushing back against Nick Fuentes and I guess challenging him to a debate. So just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. And again, like what you found so objectionable about Nick Fuentes's take on Oliver Anthony's song.
Yeah, I never really had any beef with Nick, and we got dinner together not too long ago in Los Angeles, and we talked about geopolitics a lot, Russia, talked about faith, and I think we had a lot of agreement there. But really, the dilemma started with one of his closest allies, a kid by the name of Keith Woods. And Keith Woods is like, I don't know what he calls himself, but he's I guess a white identitarian, maybe he calls himself. And the initial debate started because Keith Woods called myself and my friend Haas of the Infrared Show out about the EFF in South Africa, Julius Malema, and his singing of the Kill the Boers song. And that debate kind of started, and Haas and I talked about a 2 versus 2 debate with Keith Woods and one of his other allies, a kid named Joel. And then I don't know what happened. The debate never materialized. Ethan Schaefer was going to do the debate last Friday. And then I was good to go. I emailed Ethan. I said, I'm good to go. Haas emailed Ethan, said he's good to go. Ethan, I don't know. I don't know what happened if Keith and the other kid didn't respond or they ran, or I don't know what happened, but I'm still down to debate them. And then obviously Nick holds those same sympathies regarding South Africa's EFF party. They're a Marxist-Leninist party. And, the critique over singing that Kill the Boer song. And so that was kind of the first thing. And then this Ain't Got a Dollar song, it's like, what are you talking about? He literally called himself an elitist when he was commenting on it. He said, we're not about this. I ain't got it. The fact of the matter is, I think Nick is a nice kid. But when you look at America today, I fully support there being more Donald Trumps in the world. I think that should be our, for communists in America, that should be our goal. Get as many Donald Trumps as possible. We should have as many millionaires, as many billionaires, as many people reaching levels of prosperity as possible. But America is not that. We have a public, working men that are hungry, that have been kicked in the teeth one too many times. We have these oligarchs in our country. You have the the Rothschilds, you have the Rockefellers, you have the Bushes, DuPonts, Sacklers, you have all these people, right? Who Vanguard, BlackRock, all these groups, all these people, investment firms, whatever, banks, investment banks, that are hoarding the resources of the working man. And every time the working man tries to stand up and do something for himself, he gets kicked in the teeth again. And I think Oliver Anthony is a perfect example of that working man in this country that's just trying to stand up and say, hey, look, we have nothing. We want to, have something. We do. I think that actually Nick probably agrees with the message and the sentiment of people like Oliver Anthony. It's like, yeah, we are trying to strive for something better. And yes, we should support that. But that doesn't mean you continue to kick in the teeth of the guy that's trying to fight for himself and fight for a better future for his family. It's really the mindset of Nick Fuentes when he was commenting on that. It does remind me of how the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the DuPonts and the Sacklers and the Bushes all treat regular American working men. It's the same exact thing. And there's no place for that. So I'd be happy to debate. I think it'd be really great if we covered all these subjects, me and Haas versus Nick and Keith Woods. I think that should be the debate. I don't know who's going to host it though. It's got to be on Rumble. Like that's not a YouTube friendly debate, but I'd love to make it happen. So we'll see.
Yeah, again, his perspective on that I thought was a little weird because, I thought his whole thing was about the middle class, right? And, the Christian white middle class, of course, coming from his perspective. But, when he was talking about this Oliver Anthony song, he does sound very elitist, right? He is talking about how, we're supposed to be this aristocrat. We're supposed to aspire to be aristocrats, effectively, is what he's saying. So he's not just like not showing sympathy with the poor, but also, again, like he does seem to be pushing for being of this global elite class, which it just struck me as odd as well.
Yeah, and it's there's always going to be there's no such thing as like equality. Marx and Engels talked about how the idea of like equality is bourgeois, but if you work, you should be able to eat. It's as simple as that. That's what Lenin said. If you work, you should be able to eat. And we have way too many people in this country. I mean, we got 60,000 homeless veterans who served our country. We got way too many people that are trying to stand up for themselves and they keep getting kicked down. And I don't know, if you have people like Oliver Anthony that are speaking about that and speaking about how they want something better, I don't really understand what the purpose of kicking him down is. I mean, it is elitist, as he said. And I don't know. It's like, what ideology do you really have? What do you represent? Like, okay, Nick, you want Christians running our country rather than who he says Jews running our country? Okay, so like,
yeah, right.
What else?
Vatican first.
Yeah, what happens when the Christians are? I mean, so we have like Episcopals, you have the Rockefellers, you have the Bushes, DuPont, Sacklers. Like, what happens when all these families are Christian, Catholic, Episcopal, whatever, evangelical, Presbyterian? You have all these families, but they're still doing the same exact thing. It's not because the problem's not because of their religion in the ruling class right now. It's a function of capital and the economy as it presents itself. And that's why I say Zionism it sources its power. It's a tool that sources its power from the capitalist class. So I don't really understand what he represents. Maybe if we had a conversation, we could talk about that. I mean, I've seen plenty of his work and his shows, but you have to stand for something. I thought he stood up for the working man, but when you kick his teeth in over and over, when he's just talking about his life and his issues, then I have to come to the conclusion that no, you don't. And yes, you are an elitist, as you said you are.
So I actually had an opposite criticism of Oliver Anthony's song. And, I think that the majority of the song, or at least the first half of the song, is great. I think it is this working class anthem. What really ruins it for me is when he starts going after people on welfare and the whole fudge rounds thing. Like, that just seemed odd and out of place and incongruent. And, especially if the song is about attacking the rich, I don't know why it's necessary to bring in welfare recipients, right? Because they've been kind of screwed over by the same system and made dependent on the system by the same people, right? The rich men north of Richmond have made people dependent on them through the government. So that's what I kind of found objectionable from my perspective. I'm just wondering if you also found a problem with, you know, that part of the song, or if you know, I'm just nitpicking.
I had no problem with that part of the song. I mean, I grew up in California. I lived in Los Angeles for the past few years. I had a bunch of friends that lived either like near Compton or near the projects. I played basketball with those kids every single day. And you do see that. I mean, it's obviously the majority of welfare recipients are they lazy people eating fudge rounds? No, I don't think so. But like, there are people definitely who take advantage of the situation and of the system. That there's no doubt about that. And what I'll also add is welfare was it was a handout that was provided by the government to stymie the efforts of the communists during the time of FDR, because they were pushing aggressively, like talking all out warfare, civil war, anarchy in the streets. You know, they wanted a real change in this country. And FDR was fed the idea that, hey, look, you know, don't give them everything they want. Don't cave to all their means. But here's what you can do to get rid of the problem. Just provide this, you know, welfare plan, provide this, you know, New Deal packages, whatever. Some parts of it were good, some not so good. And that's gonna quell the masses. That's gonna do away with the problems you have right now, the people coming at you with the pitchforks. So I think as a whole, welfare was utilized and has still been today utilized to try and keep the masses from actually standing up. You know, you give them just enough to get by, and in many cases not to get by. So I don't really have any I don't think that we should be pushing to like maintain the welfare system. I think we should be pushing to fundamentally reorientate our economy, in the sense that no one has to be on welfare anymore. I mean, there's more than enough wealth in this country to go around. If everyone's working, everyone can eat. And I think that's what we need to be focusing on, rather than like, you know, worrying about, oh, are we going to continue to protect these, you know, social welfare systems? I don't really, I hope that we can reach a point in our country where we no longer have to have anyone that utilizes welfare systems to get by.
Yeah, unfortunately, I kind of see it going the opposite way, at least under the current regime, and particularly with debt. It seems as though we're just seeing more and more people get in debt. Obviously, you know, student loans is a big hot button issue, and that's actually resuming this month. But, you know, medical debt, credit card debt, mortgages, it just seems as though we're becoming a nation of indentured servants. And, you know, I think that really has to have a profound impact on the American psyche, right? Because it's like, it doesn't matter how much money you are making, you're just paying interest on all of these loans that you have.
They govern by debt. That's literally just how they govern. They govern by debt. And I think, I mean, I agree with you 100%, but when you talk about like I said, you know, a large scale effort to reorient our economy, it is going to look like dealing with every single question. I mean, it's going to be completely different. If you have a broad sweeping plan that actually addresses all the problems of the American public today, you would have all public commodities that are all commodities being made public. So, you know, if anything in that can be done to the benefit of the common man, the common good, I think that's what we should push for. So energy, oil, gas, nuclear, whatever, that should be a public commodity. Banking, I think that should be a public commodity. I mean, that alone is going to address 50% of the issues we have. If we have public banks and we have public commodities, public transportation, all that stuff, I mean, it's going to completely change the way that the average American lives his or her life. These are some of the largest sources of monopoly capital, finance capital on the face of the planet, let alone in our own country. If you change these institutions to work for the public good rather than to, you know, kick them down and rape them for every last penny that they have, that's going to address a lot of the problems. But there's more that can be done, of course, but I think that would be a great start.
Well, the last thing I want to talk to you about today is what's been happening in Africa. I mean, you mentioned you know, it briefly there, but recently there's been a lot of well, there's been a couple of coups in Africa. There was a coup in Niger, there was a coup in Gabon, and these are people rising up against the the former French colonial government that have been in place here. So it seems as though the people of Africa are really pushing back against the neocolonialism that has been in place. And I'm just wondering where you think this may be going, because it's very interesting to see just these people rise up, especially at this point in history, and say we want this neocolonialism, we want this neo-imperialism out of our country. Do you think we're going to see more of these kinds of coups? Do you think that we're going to possibly see some wars, more wars in Africa, or where do you think this is going?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a couple or a few more of these coups take place. We'll see. I mean, Gabon is not the Sahel region. It's further southeast on the continent, but so it's already spreading from just out of the Sahel region. But I mean, we've seen Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, Central African Republic, and we've now seen the one in Gabon. My concern is that I think that these are far too important for the French and the European Union as a whole to just give up. France gets 25% of its uranium from Niger alone. The European Union gets like 20% as a whole of its uranium from Niger. They're talking about military intervention. It seems as though there's proposals still being circulated. I think the most recent proposal from the government in Niger, the military junta, was a 9-month transition window to a civilian-run government. But I don't know if they're going to accept that. And if we have war, it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be like Russia versus Ukraine. I mean, A, it's going to be much more bloody. B, you're going to have a lot of people fighting on the side of these revolutionary governments that have literally no military training whatsoever. I mean, these are people just saying, we want the French out and we want to stand up. Give me a gun. Let's go fight. So that's going to be bad. And you look on the other side, you've got Nigeria. Nigeria is it's like huge population, one of the largest populations in the world, rich country, very well-trained military. I mean, they're gonna steamroll. It's gonna be bad and bloody. And I'm hoping it doesn't come to that. But if that is what it comes to, I think it's going to be a very bad outcome, assuming no one steps in. China, Russia doesn't step in to provide some sort of a defense parameter for those revolutionary governments. But we'll have to wait and see what happens.
And it would be interesting to see that, because, again, I think this is part of a larger geopolitical dynamic that we're seeing right now, right? It's the push towards multipolarity, breaking away from U.S. hegemony. And again, it seems as though we are in a historic moment. You're not just seeing that with these coups. You're not just seeing that with Ukraine, but with BRICS and with the move away from the U.S. dollar and seemingly the collapse of the U.S. dollar that we're living through here. So yeah, again, it just goes back to, I think we're living through some interesting times.
Mm-hmm. I 100% agree.
Well, Jackson, again, I really do appreciate you joining me today. Again, I know you have a huge audience that's growing every single day, but for folks out there who would like to follow you and support you, how can they do that?
YouTube, for however much longer they keep us there, The Dive with Jackson Hinkle. I'm on Rumble and X as well, so you can find me all those places.
Well, thanks again, Jackson. I really do appreciate it, and hopefully I can have you back again sometime soon.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me on.